Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Consciousness, Force and Understanding, Appearance in the Supersensible World, continued. From the idea, then, of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element, and this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as in a difference, a repulsion of the same as self-same from itself, and likeness of the unlike as unlike. We have to think pure change or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, or contradiction. For in the difference, which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. If it were, it would simply be, without being an opposite. But it is the opposite of an opposite, or the other is itself immediately present in it. Certainly I put the opposite here, and the other of which it is the opposite, there. The opposite then is on one side is in and for itself, without the other. But just because I have the opposite herein and for itself, it is the opposite of itself, or it has, in fact, the other immediately present to it. Thus the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world, and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, that is, the inversion of itself. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it a difference as in a difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. We see that through infinity, law completes itself in an immanent necessity, and all the moments of the world of appearance are taken up into the inner world. That the simple character of law is infinity means, according to what we have found, that it is self-identical, but it is also in itself different, or it is the self-same which repels itself from itself, or sunders itself into two. What was called simple force duplicates itself, and through its infinity, its law is law. Secondly, what is thus derempted, which constitutes the parts through thought of as in the law, exhibits itself as a stable existence, and if the parts are considered without the notion of the inner difference, then space and time, or distance and velocity, which appear as moments of gravity, are just as indifferent and without a necessary relation to one another as to gravity itself, or as this simple gravity is indifferent to them, or again as simple electricity is indifferent to positive and negative electricity. But thirdly, through the notion of inner difference, these unlike and indifferent moments, space and time, etc., are a difference which is no difference, or only a difference of what is self-same, and its essence is unity. As positive and negative, they stimulate each other into activity, and their being is rather to posit themselves as not being, and to suspend themselves in the unity. The two distinguished moments both subsist. They are implicit and are opposite in themselves. That is, each is the opposite of itself. Each has its other within it, and they are only one unity. This simple infinity, or the absolute notion, may be called the simple essence of life, the soul of the world, the universal blood, whose omnipresence is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but rather is itself every difference, as also their supersession. It pulsates within itself, but it does not move, inwardly vibrates, yet is at rest. It is self-identical, for the differences are tautological. They are differences that are none. This self-identical essence is therefore related only to itself. To itself implies relationship to an other, and the relation to itself is rather a self-sundering, or in other words, that very self-identicalness is an inner difference. These sundered moments are thus in and for themselves, each and opposite of another. Thus in each moment the other is at the same time expressed, or each is not the opposite of another, but only a pure opposite, and so each is therefore in its own self the opposite of itself. In other words, it is not an opposite at all, but is purely for itself a pure self-identical essence that has no difference in it. Accordingly, we do not need to ask the question, still less to think that fretting over such a question is philosophy, or even that it is a question philosophy cannot answer. The question, namely, how from this pure essence, how does difference or otherness issue forth from it, for the division into two moments has already taken place. Difference is excluded from the self-identical and set apart from it. What was supposed to be the self-identical is thus already one of these two moments instead of being the absolute essence. That the self-identical divides itself into two means, therefore, just as well that it supersedes itself as already divided, supersedes itself as an otherness, the unity of which it is usual to say that difference cannot issue from it, is in fact itself one of the two moments. It is the abstraction of the simplicity or unitary nature over against the difference. But in saying that the unity is an abstraction, that is only one of the opposed moments, it is already implied that it is the dividing of itself, for if the unity is a negative, is opposed to something, then it is eo ipso posited as that which has an antithesis within it. The different moments of self-sundering and of becoming self-identical are therefore likewise only this movement of self-supersession. For since the self-identical, which is supposed first to sunder itself or become its opposite, is an abstraction or is already itself a sundered moment, it is self-sundering. Its self-sundering is therefore a supersession of what it is, and therefore the supersession of its dividedness. Its becoming self-identical is equally a self-sundering. What becomes identical with itself thereby opposes itself to its self-sundering. That is, it thereby puts itself on one side, or rather it becomes a sundered moment. Infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement, in which whatever is determined in one way or another, for example as being, is rather the opposite of this determinateness. This no doubt has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before, but it is the inner world that it has first freely and clearly shown itself. Appearance or the play of forces already displays it, but it is an explanation that it first freely stands forth, and in being finally an object for consciousness as that which it is, consciousness is thus self-consciousness. The understanding's explanation is primarily only the description of what self-consciousness is. It supersedes the differences present in the law, differences which have already become pure differences, but are still indifferent, and posits them in a single unity in force. But this unifying of them is equally and immediately a sundering, for it supersedes the differences and posits the oneness of force only by creating a new difference, that of law and force, which, however, at the same time is no difference, and moreover, from the fact that this difference is no difference, it goes on to supersede this difference again, since it lets force be similarly constituted to law. But this movement or necessity is thus still a necessity and a movement of the understanding, or the movement as such is not the understanding's object. On the contrary, in this movement the understanding has an object, positive and negative electricity, distance, force of attraction, and 1,000 other things which constitute the content of the moments of the movement. The reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction is just because in it consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself, enjoying only itself, although it seems to be busy with something else. It is in fact occupied only with itself. In the contrary law, as the inversion of the first law, or in the inner difference, it is true that infinity itself becomes the object of the understanding, but once again the understanding falls short of infinity as such, since it again apportions to two worlds, or to two substantial elements. That which is the difference is in itself the self-repulsion, or the self-same and the self-attraction of the unlike. To the understanding, the movement as it is found in experience is here a mere happening, and the self-same and the unlike are predicates, whose essence is an inert substrata, what is for the understanding an object in a sensuous covering is for us in its essential form as a pure notion. This apprehension of the difference as it is in truth, or the apprehension of infinity as such, is for us, or in itself, that is merely implicit. The exposition of its notion belongs to science, but consciousness, in the way that it immediately has this notion, again comes on the scene as a form belonging to consciousness itself, or as a new shape of consciousness, which does not recognize in what has gone before its own essence, but looks on it as something quite different. Since this notion of infinity is an object of consciousness, the latter is consciousness of a difference that is no less immediately cancelled. Consciousness is for its own self. It is a distinguishing of that which contains no difference or self-consciousness. I distinguish myself from myself, and in doing so I am directly aware that what is distinguished from myself is not different from me. I, the self-same being, repel myself from myself, but what is posited as distinct from me, or is as unlike me, is immediately, in being so distinguished, not a distinction for me. It is true that consciousness of another, of an object in general, is itself necessarily self-consciousness, reflectedness into self-consciousness of itself in its otherness. The necessary advance from the previous shapes of consciousness, for which their truth was a thing, and other than themselves, expresses just this, that not only is consciousness of a thing possible only for a self-consciousness, but that self-consciousness alone is the truth of those shapes. But it is only for us that this truth exists, and yet for consciousness. But self-consciousness has at first become simply for itself, not yet as a unity with consciousness in general. We see that the inner world of appearance, the understanding in truth, comes to know nothing else but appearance, but not in the shape of a play of forces, but rather that play of forces in its absolutely universal moments and in their movement. In fact, the understanding experiences only itself. Raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself, closed in a unity with the supersensible world, through the mediating term of appearance, through which it gazes into this background lying behind appearance. The two extremes of this syllogism, the one of the pure inner world, the other that of the inner being, and gazing into this pure inner world, have now coincided, and just as they, qua extremes, have vanished, so too the middle term, as something other than these extremes, has also vanished. This curtain of appearance, hanging before the inner world, is therefore drawn away, and we have the inner being, the I, gazing into the inner world, the vision of the undifferentiated self-same being, which repels itself from itself, posits itself as an inner being containing different moments, but for which equally these moments are immediately not different self-consciousness. It is manifest that behind the so-called curtain, which is supposed to conceal the inner world, there is nothing to be seen unless we go behind it ourselves, as much in order that we may see, as that there may be something behind there which can be seen. But at the same time, it is evident that we cannot, without more ado, go straight away behind appearance, for this knowledge of what is the truth of appearance as ordinarily conceived, and of its inner being, is itself only a result of a complex movement whereby the modes of consciousness, meaning, perceiving, and the understanding vanish, and it will be equally evident that the cognition of what consciousness knows in knowing itself requires a still more complete movement, the exposition of which is contained in what follows.